Having found himself reincarnated into the My Hero world, our main protagonist will try to live up to his namesake. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy, Omni-sensei. Welcome to What If I Was Reborn as Ironman in MHA, Part 7. Hit that thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Also, remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into it. Third person's POV. All Might stood in his blue, gold, and red armor, flexing as the lenses on his eyes glowed blue with power, matching the Stark reactor in his chest. "We are Iron Might," Tony proudly declared before they both dropped into a running position. "So cool." All Might heard Melissa's voice from a bit further back, making him chuckle. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." FO laughed, seeing All Might. AFO then heard Tony chuckle through All Might's armor. "I didn't know foresight was one of your quirks." "Ready, All Might?" Tony asked as thrusters on All Might's feet appeared, activating and waiting to be unleashed. "As ready as you are, young Stark," All Might replied, his signature large grin returning. "Good. You deal with the punching, I'll handle the tech." Friday. Hit it. Song. Survivor. Eye of the Tiger. BAM. Bam bam bam. Bam bam bam. "Stark, is that music I'm hearing?" All Might asked as the power from the thrusters increased, creating a massive flare behind them while they remained in position. Meanwhile, black lightning crackled from AFO's fingers, destroying the ground slightly with its discharge. "Let's rock and roll, baby," Tony shouted as the thrusters on All Might's feet ignited, sending him rocketing toward All for One. The ground beneath him exploded into rubble, the force of the takeoff leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The combined power of All Might's muscles and Tony's advanced technology propelled them forward like a bullet, their movements perfectly synchronized. Rising up, back on the street. Did my time, took my chances. All for One's eyes narrowed as he watched them approach, black lightning crackling from his fingertips. With a sneer, he extended both arms, unleashing a torrent of dark energy in their direction. The ground beneath him trembled as his raw power distorted the air around them. "Brace yourself, All Might," Tony's voice echoed through the suit as the nanites adjusted the armor, creating an energy shield just in time to absorb the brunt of AFO's attack. "Went the distance. Now I'm back on my feet, just a man and his will to survive." The shield held, but the force of the blast sent All Might skidding back across the broken ground. Gritting his teeth, All Might dug his heels in, roaring as the thrusters on his back activated, launching him into the sky. With a flick of his wrist, All for One sent a barrage of tendrils made of black energy soaring upward to meet him. "You think your fancy suit will make a difference? You're only delaying the inevitable." All Might twisted midair, dodging the tendrils with ease. "It's not the suit that makes me strong," he bellowed. "It's the heart behind it. It's the eye of the tiger. It's the thrill of the fight, rising up to the challenge of our rival." Tony's AI adjusted their flight path with precision, allowing All Might to come down like a meteor, fist cocked back. Now All Might, full power. The nanites on his fist glowed with intense energy as All Might rocketed toward AFO. His punch connected with an earth-shattering impact, a shockwave rippling through the battlefield. The force sent AFO flying back, crashing through multiple buildings, each one collapsing like dominoes from the sheer devastation. But AFO wasn't finished. His body shifted, using a combination of quirks to regenerate and enhance his strength. He roared in fury, his form bulging grotesquely as he shot back toward All Might, his arm transforming into a massive drill. "You will fall, just like your predecessor." All Might met him head-on, their fists colliding in a thunderous explosion. The ground beneath them cracked and split open, debris raining down like meteors as they exchanged blows at lightning speed. and the last known survivor stalks his prey in the night. And he's watching us all with the eye of the tiger. Tony, boost the thrusters, All Might shouted, feeling the strain in his muscles. On it, Tony responded, increasing the power to maximum. The thrusters ignited once more, adding extra force to All Might's next punch. The blow connected with AFO's torso, sending him crashing into the ground with enough force to create a massive crater. AFO coughed, blood spurting from his mouth, but he quickly regenerated, growling in frustration. You think you can keep this up forever? All Might, hit him with everything you've got. This is the final push, Tony's voice urged. With a roar that echoed through the battlefield, All Might unleashed his signature move, United States of Smash. His fist came down like a hammer, enhanced by the full power of Tony's suit and his indomitable spirit. The impact created a blinding flash of light, the ground beneath them shattering completely, as both AFO and All Might's armored fist connected. The collision of All Might's fist and All for One's dark, pulsating power unleashed an explosion so intense that the air itself seemed to warp. The shockwave was deafening, as the ground beneath them splintered and cracked like fragile glass. The blinding flash of energy radiated outward, shaking buildings miles away and sending massive chunks of earth flying in every direction. For a split second, it seemed like time had frozen. The force of their combined power suspended everything, holding them in a fragile balance. Tony's voice broke through the static in All Might's helmet. All Might, hold steady. We've almost got him. All Might's muscles strained beneath the suit as he pushed forward, grinding his teeth together in pure determination. AFO's energy was fierce, his power immense, but Tony's technology was pushing All Might beyond his limits, amplifying his strength with every surge of power. All for One growled, his face twisted in fury, black tendrils of energy lashing out wildly. You think this is enough to stop me? But All Might pressed on, inch by inch, the ground quaking beneath his feet. No villain will ever win as long as I stand. With one final push, All Might's fist, glowing with the combined force of his and Tony's power, broke through AFO's defenses. The impact shattered the dark energy, and All for One's body contorted violently from the blow. Now, Tony shouted, seizing the moment. The thrusters on All Might's suit kicked into overdrive, sending him rocketing forward with blinding speed. His fist, still radiating power, struck AFO square in the chest with an earth-shattering impact, crumpling the villain's armor-like exterior and sending shockwaves rippling through his body. AFO's eyes widened in disbelief as the power behind the punch overwhelmed his defenses, his black aura splintering and fading. All for One let out a strangled cry as he was launched backward, his body slamming into the ground with the force of a meteor, creating a massive crater. The villain's once immense power faltered, his form now limp and broken, as smoke rose from his shattered figure. Rising up to the challenge of our rival, All Might, his armored fist still glowing, stood tall above the devastation. His breathing was heavy, the strain of the battle weighing on him, but he remained resolute. Tony's voice crackled through the comms, barely masking the excitement. That was incredible, All Might. All Might's smile returned, wider than ever, as he raised his fist in victory. We did it, young Stark. Together. But as the dust settled and the battlefield grew quiet, AFO's mangled body began to stir. His voice, hoarse and labored, echoed faintly. This isn't over. We'll return, stronger than ever. All Might's smile faltered, but Tony's voice cut in with determination. Not if we have anything to say about it. Friday, Tony commanded, containment protocol. Let's make sure this guy stays down. As AFO tried to rise, a cage of energy beams materialized around him, courtesy of the suit's built-in protocols. The villain's body twitched as he fought against it, but he was too weak to break free. Tony's voice rang out one final time. And that's checkmate, All for One. Third person's POV, so All Might, for our final heroic act as Iron Might, Shall we go and put a stop to all the Nomu? Tony asked through his armor. What about him? All Might replied, glancing at all for one, securely contained in a device that rendered him unable to escape. Trust me when I say he has no hope of getting out of that thing. Plus, I'll have the Iron Legion standing guard in case he tries anything, Tony assured confidently. All Might nodded, surveying the heroes still battling the Nomu. He exhaled deeply, flexed his muscles, and lunged forward with his fist by his side, a wide grin spreading across his face. Let's go, young Stark. One final act of heroism between our combined forces for today. Tony mimicked All Might's signature laugh. And they shall never fear. Why? All Might's smile widened as he laughed back, and both heroes shouted in unison, because we are here. The lenses over All Might's eyes blazed brightly, mirroring the reactor's glow as if responding to their triumphant declaration. In a flash, Tony and All Might surged forward, becoming a streak of color and light, All Might's exuberant smile ever present. All Might intercepted a large Nomu advancing toward them, positioning himself with a hand hovering dramatically over his face. He delivered a powerful uppercut to the creature's abdomen, causing it to cough up blood and shatter the metal casing around its arm before sending it flying into the sky. Next, he rocketed toward a group of Nomu breaking free from Kamui's wooden cage, armed with flamethrowers and energy weapons. From All Might's shoulders, a small device emerged from the nanosuit, launching micro-missiles that soared through the air, exploding into massive fireballs that released waves of heat and shook the ground. He soared through the smoke cloud and found himself facing a cluster of Nomu attempting to scale MT Lady's legs. Moving almost like a blur, All Might circled around her, firing repulsor blasts from his hands. Each shot struck true, knocking the Nomu down toward the ground. A weapon materialized over All Might's forearm, shooting out a blue and gold orb that detonated into a large net, discharging a powerful electric shock that stunned the Nomu and disabled their weapons. Then, All Might spotted Best Jeanist and Edge Shot struggling to restrain a massive Nomu that towered over them. They were both laboring to keep it down. Without hesitation, All Might dropped in from behind, crashing down with such force that the ground shattered beneath him. Best Jeanist and Edge Shot nearly lost their footing but managed to hold on. Thanks, All Might, Best Jeanist nodded in appreciation. All Might swiftly reached down, ripping out the Nomu's enhancers. From his back, a large star-shaped object emerged, controlled by Tony. The device spun around All Might, releasing beams of repulsion that targeted the flying Nomu, clearing the area of their threat. Suddenly, they were hit by a blast of energy, forcing them to take a couple of steps back without sustaining any damage. They turned toward the source to see a Nomu with a mask over its mouth, preparing to launch another attack. All Might zigzagged along the ground, boosting through the battlefield toward the Nomu while deftly dodging its incoming shots. Aura, 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 Tony shouted as he rapidly punched the Nomu. He maneuvered All Might's foot to step on top of the creature's foot, anchoring it down and preventing its movement. With a powerful swing of his fist, All Might shattered the Nomu's mouthpiece with an uppercut, sending it crashing to the ground. He then unleashed a devastating uni-beam that pinned the beast firmly to the ground, leaving it unresponsive. All the heroes continued to see was a flashing of blue, gold, and red as All Might's figure rapidly flew everywhere, taking down and securing the Nomus so they wouldn't be a threat any longer. Tony and All Might were now separated as they watched the heroes load the Nomu into one of the police vans designed by Tony. Tony and All Might especially paid attention to the van into which All for One was being loaded. So, what are you going to do now, All Might? Tony asked curiously. I'll be joining them to make sure that AFO doesn't escape. And when we get to the prison, I will talk to Tamura to see if he can be rehabilitated. I just hope that AFO's grasp on him isn't too deep. All Might climbed into the van where AFO was secured. I'll follow along just in case, until AFO is safely inside the prison. You don't have to, All Might started. But Tony interrupted, shaking his head. It's for my own peace of mind. You really do have some pretty strong trust issues. All Might said with an awkward smile as he watched Tony get in and sit across from him. It's really nothing personal. It's more about my narcissistic tendencies. Tony shrugged. All Might shook his head, amused by Tony's words. So hey, All Might, have you ever thought about getting married? Tony suddenly asked, surprising All Might with such a question. Why the sudden interest? All Might wondered. Actually, I want to know too. Melissa's voice sounded from Tony's armor. I mean, you've taken down your big bad, right? Usually, when that happens, the hero retires, settles down, falls in love, gets married, and has children. So I'm curious if we could be expecting a Mrs. Might. Yeah, I want to know if I should expect an Aunt Might as well, Melissa said teasingly. All Might chuckled at their curiosity and shook his head. I'm sorry to disappoint you both, but I don't plan on any of that. The only thing I will be married to is my hero work. All Might, I care about you, but that didn't sound as cool as you thought it did, Tony said, shaking his head. It's honestly saddening, Melissa muttered. All Might's smile faltered upon hearing their criticism, but he shook his head. They then spent the majority of the trip to the prison teasing All Might about getting married, while All Might teased them back about their marriage. Once Tony saw that AFO was safely secured, he took off the band around his head, and Friday safely secured his nanosuit. Tony stretched a bit before pressing a button on the metal disc and watching it collapse. Melissa watched as Tony put everything away with a pensive look on his face. So, what's bothering you? Melissa asked, tilting her head in confusion. Huh? Tony asked, tilting his head in confusion. You have this pensive look on your face. You get this frown when your eyebrows scrunch up, and that only happens when you're thinking about something deeply, Melissa said, already familiar with Tony's expressions. Tony's lips twisted as he said, It's just something that's bothering me about all of this. The Dark Forger, the one I think is enhancing the Nomus cybernetically. We know he was recruited by them, so where was he? He wasn't in the bar and wasn't captured. So he's still out there. Melissa's eyes widened in shock. You don't mean... Yeah, this is far from over. In a hidden laboratory. Sparks flew as code ran rapidly through multiple computer screens. Teo Seiki chuckled darkly. Oh Ultron, you will be my greatest creation yet. Third person's POV Melissa sighed and shook her head at Tony's words. I can't say I'm that surprised. It's typical villain behavior. The only thing you can do is have Friday keep a constant watch on the prison. If the Dark Forger is really in cahoots with them, it stands to reason he'll try to break AFO out. Tony let out a frustrated sigh, causing Melissa to chuckle softly. She reached behind her and placed the bowl of grapes on the table before patting her lap. Tony raised an eyebrow, confused by her gesture. Melissa responded by patting her lap even more insistently. Still puzzled, Tony eventually sat down on her lap, unsure of what she wanted. Tony, I meant your head, not your whole body, Melissa said, her expression dead serious. Tony blinked in embarrassment. Ah, he mumbled, quickly moving to lie down with his head on her lap. Melissa rolled her eyes but smiled as she brushed his hair out of his face. You totally did that on purpose. You knew what I meant. I plead the fifth, Tony replied, flashing a mischievous grin. Melissa pinched his nose playfully, making him talk in a muffled tone. So why are you doing this? Tony asked, his voice nasally as he wiggled free of her grip. To help you relax, Melissa said, running her fingers through his hair. This was supposed to be our day off, but here you are, finding ways to stay busy. Working nonstop isn't healthy, Tony. Tony raised an eyebrow. Didn't we literally just get back from shopping, eating, and, well, getting a little freaky in the bathroom stall? I count that as a break. A faint blush crept onto Melissa's cheeks, but she composed herself. I mean a whole day, not just a couple of hours before diving right back into work. When was the last time you took a real break? Huh? No inventing, no brainstorming, no business calls. Just a whole day of doing nothing but cuddling on the couch, watching movies. Tony glanced away, his expression hardening. Melissa, we can't just take breaks like that. It's not how we work. Melissa frowned, tilting her head in concern. What are you so afraid of? Tony blinked, looking genuinely baffled. What the hell are you talking about? You're defensive, she pointed out, her tone gentle but teasing. I know you well enough to see when you're hiding something. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his and locking eyes with him. I'm your girlfriend, right? Yeah? Tony replied cautiously. So, I want to be there for you, to support you when you're scared, worried, happy, sad, everything. I'm not a mind reader, Tony. I need you to be open with me, to tell me when something's bothering you. Just like I'd come to you when something's wrong. Tony fell silent, his gaze wandering as he processed her words. Melissa stayed still, her fingers gently tracing the lines of his face, offering silent encouragement. Finally, Tony sighed, his voice quieter than before. It's not fear exactly, he began slowly, but I'm anxious, worried. Melissa remained quiet, letting him continue at his own pace. We live in a world full of powered individuals, villains who can wipe out cities if they really wanted to. And that's just what we know about. There are hidden threats, Melissa, dangers we can't even see coming. What if something happens? What if I'm not strong enough to stop it when it does? Melissa's brows furrowed in confusion. You're thinking way too far ahead. What danger could possibly be that catastrophic? Tony shook his head, his expression darkening. I'm not even convinced the multiverse isn't real. Melissa blinked, clearly taken aback. What does that have to do with anything we're talking about? Tony's gaze remained distant. If the multiverse exists, then there are infinite versions of me. Some smarter, some crazier. What if one of them decides to conquer everything? What if we aren't strong enough to stop them? And it doesn't even have to be me. What if some being from an alternate reality finds their way here and just decides to end everything on a whim? Melissa cupped Tony's face and gave him a firm shake, her eyes soft but serious. Tony, do you even hear yourself right now? That's a once-in-an-infinite possibilities kind of scenario. You can't spend your life worrying about something like that. Tony let out another sigh, frustration etched across his face. But that's the thing, Melissa. Even if it's a once-in-an-infinite possibility, it's still one. It means it could happen. And if it could happen, I need to be prepared. A single day off feels like a day wasted. Time I could be spending getting stronger, smarter, better. Building something to protect us from whatever's out there. Something unimaginable. His eyes drifted ahead, his expression darkening as if he were seeing something only he could understand. I'm cursed with knowledge, he murmured, the weight of the words heavy between them. I'll always be worried, always anxious, but that's what drives me. It's not something I can shut off. My anxiety is what pushes me forward. I have to think about what could happen, even if it never does. Because if it does happen and I wasn't ready for it, I couldn't live with that. Melissa watched him carefully, the tension in his face and the tightness in his jaw. She could see how deeply his thoughts spiraled, always racing ahead to a future only he could anticipate. Slowly, she reached out, cupping his face in her hands, her fingers tender against his skin. Tony's expression then turned a bit awkward. Can we talk about something else, please? I don't want to talk about this topic anymore, Melissa nodded, accepting his wishes, knowing how hard it was for Tony to share what he just did. Like she had previously said, she knows Tony, and one thing she knows about him is how he hates being vulnerable, whether it's physically or emotionally. So she was very happy and glad that he was able to open up to her. Tony shifted over, hugging Melissa's waist as she ruffled his hair with a soft smile. Third person's POV. Melissa, seeing Tony's expression, felt a bit bad, so she made him sit up on the couch. What are you doing? Tony asked, eyeing Melissa curiously. Melissa only smirked as she stood up and crouched between Tony's legs. Making you feel better, obviously, Melissa said, rolling her eyes in a sensual manner as she went and began pulling Tony's pants down. Tony sat there with widened eyes as he saw Melissa take a hold of his tool and began jerking him until he began to grow in size. Tony was about to say something when Melissa interrupted him. Sure, just enjoy, Melissa said, winking, Then coitus happened. Melissa then looked towards Tony teasingly. She wiped some of his juice off her face and licked her before winking towards Tony. Yummy, she said seductively. The things you do to me, woman, Tony said, feeling himself hardening at her actions, while Melissa just giggled, happy to see the effects she had on him. She then leaned forward and pretended to talk to his tool. She gave it a kiss and whispered towards it. Thank you for the delicious meal. Third person's POV. Tony and Melissa were sleeping in their hotel room, huddled together in bed, their bodies bare except for a blanket covering their lower halves. A blaring alarm resounded from their phones, startling them awake. Friday, what's going on? Tony asked groggily as he rubbed his face. There's someone approaching the presidential suite from outside the building, Friday reported. Tony sighed. I'll go check it out. I'll come with you, Melissa said, grabbing her suit disc from her side. Tony held out his hand, and his ring flew onto his finger, instantly triggering his suit to form around his body. Melissa quickly followed suit. Cape, Tony called to Melissa. Melissa nodded, taking her cape and tossing it toward Tony. The fabric wrapped around him, allowing Tony to phase through the wall and fly outside, with Melissa following closely behind. Once outside, the cape flew off Tony's body and reattached to Melissa's back. They circled the building, spotting a man casually walking up the side of the structure. He had slicked back red hair, wore a black jacket that covered the lower half of his face, and carried a sword at his waist. And where do you think you're going, mister? Do you know what time it is? You're kinda interrupting my beauty sleep, Tony sighed. The man's shoulders slumped as he placed a hand on his sword. Translation: I knew they said security would be heavy since it's the president. But come on, I didn't even get a chance to go inside yet. Melissa replied, raising an eyebrow. Translation: what did you honestly expect? It's the president. The man tilted his head in confusion. I didn't expect American heroes to speak Russian, he said in English, with a thick Russian accent. And aren't you two a bit too young to be heroes? We're kinda interning, Tony shrugged. The man leaned back and sighed in exasperation. I'm dealing with a bunch of children. Friday, you got anything on him? Tony asked quietly. Before Friday could report, Tony quickly formed a shield in front of him as a red crescent of flames slammed against it. Now, that wasn't very nice, Tony said, shaking his head. Here I am, trying to get some information, and you attack me. The man crouched by the building, his shoes glowing slightly blue, holding his sword level with his eyes. His eyes glowed red as flames began to swirl beneath his feet. You want a name? I'll give it to you. In America, it's pronounced Cinder Wolf, he said before rocketing forward with expert precision. He slashed at Melissa, his sword catching fire. To his surprise, the sword passed right through her. Caught off guard, Cinder didn't have time to react as Melissa fired a repulsor from her palm, blasting him downward. He tumbled along the ground before coming to a stop, groaning. He muttered in pain. Translation: that's going to hurt in the morning? His eyes widened in shock as he saw multiple constructs of guns and rifles materializing around him, all aimed at him. Tightening his grip on his sword, Cinder moved in a blur, rapidly cutting through the bullets. However, despite his speed, he wasn't fast enough to block them all and grunted in pain as several shots made contact, though his armor underneath his jacket absorbed most of the damage. Cinder began striking down the constructs when Melissa reappeared, emerging from the ground as bullets passed through her. She punched him in the stomach with enough force to make his eyes roll back and vomit, sending him flying into a car, shattering the windows and caving in the vehicle. A giant blue-silver hand then materialized, grabbing Cinder Wolf from the wreckage of the car. Poor car. I hope it has villain insurance, Tony quipped, shaking his head as he brought Cinder closer, the man's head swaying side to side, trapped in the grip of the fist. Tony then began shaking the fist as if it were a toy, an action figure of sorts. Come on, wake up. We need to talk. Cinder's head was still swaying side to side before his eyes snapped open, glowing bright red. He kicked both feet up, smashing flames against the construct, shattering it and dropping back to the ground. He landed on his feet and slid to the side with a blast of fire from one foot, making a 180-degree turn, burn marks appearing on the ground. He blasted forward, running toward the car wreckage and grabbing his sword from the floor before running away, leaving a trail of embers. However, as he ran, Melissa and Tony appeared flying right next to him. "You're not thinking of running away, are you?" Tony teased. Cinder skidded to a stop, creating burn marks along the road, causing Tony and Melissa to fly ahead. He turned around and ran in the opposite direction. "I call dibs," Melissa said as they turned around. She flew down toward the ground, picking up speed, getting ahead of Cinder. She spun around and looked in his direction. Once she calculated the distance, she appeared from the ground, ready to clothesline him. However, Cinder had already anticipated her move and had his sword ready to strike. Melissa quickly realized she had no choice but to turn intangible. If she let Cinder hit her with the sword, it would have broken, injuring him fatally. So, she let him pass through her arm, and once he was past, she quickly turned around and grabbed the back of his jacket. Due to the speed Cinder was running at, his feet kicked into the air as Melissa held onto him, and once his feet were in the air, she pulled him down toward the ground with enough force to shatter it. Cinder coughed up blood as he lay sprawled out on the ground. Tony then appeared, encasing his entire body in multiple chains and lifting him into the air. "Shall we try this again?" As Tony closed his fist, the chains tightened around Cinder's body. "Ah!" Cinder screamed in pain. Soon, they heard a sizzling sound, causing Cinder to scream more as the chains, made of light, began heating up. All right. He yelled in pain, causing the sizzling to stop. Translation: I'll talk, just stop hurting me. "Why are you after the president?" Melissa asked. Cinder panted and groaned as the chains tightened. "For money," he grunted. "Surely you know the president is heavily guarded. Why would you take such a mission for money?" "I almost don't believe you," Tony said, tilting his head in confusion as he held up his ring. "You'd take the mission too if you knew how much money was on the line," Cinder said, panting in his thick Russian accent. "And how much money are we talking about? Why would someone put a bounty on the president?" Tony asked curiously. "I don't know the reason, but the amount is 5 billion euros. Every assassin who's heard of the bounty will come for his head." Friday: "I can't find any information on this bounty from any sources online. I've even scanned the dark web and black market, and there's nothing there," Friday said, showing Tony her empty search results. Tony closed his fist again, and his ring glowed, dislocating Cinder's arm. "Ah! Why? I'm not lying. So why can't I find anything about it online?" "Because it wasn't posted online. The person behind this bounty didn't want to risk it being traced back to him. It was done manually. We get information from brokers who alert us to big bounties in exchange for a cut of the money. So you won't find it online." Tony and Melissa exchanged a glance before being interrupted by Cinder laughing slightly to himself. "And what's so funny?" Melissa asked, raising an eyebrow. Boss," Friday called out warily toward Tony. Tony tapped his ear. "Yeah," he asked apprehensively, while Cinder smirked at them. Cinder said with a smirk. Translation: Every single assassin and villain who's heard of this bounty will stop at nothing to get it, so be prepared, little heroes. You won't be getting any more beauty sleep. Friday showed Tony a map of their location, with red dots slowly appearing around the hotel. "Ah, Ironman," Melissa called out. "Yep, look up." When Tony did, he saw villains standing on the rooftops, looking down at them, with more appearing by the second. Tony sighed, backhanding Cinder unconscious and dissipating the chains. Slowly, he and Melissa began to rise until they were floating in the air, their backs pressed together as they spun in a circle. They raised their arms, their palms glowing brightly in the night, revealing their repulsors. "We're not getting any sleep tonight, are we?" Melissa asked softly. "I highly doubt it. Friday, bring up my superhero playlist. We might as well listen to some good tunes while kicking some major ass." Song, Holding Out for a Hero by Bonnie Tyler. Hearing the beat, Melissa sighed. We seriously need to talk about your love for ancient music. Tony smirked before they blasted off, leaving a trail of light behind them as all the assassins surged toward the hotel and the president. Third person's POV stars and Stripes finished suiting up in her hotel room and stepped out into the hallway. A few feet away, two guards stood by a large door watching over it. She approached them and asked, "Have you seen if those two have left their rooms since they arrived?" One of the guards closed his eyes briefly, as if concentrating, then shook his head. "They're not inside. It seems like they're still outside." "Outside?" Star asked, confused. "The last report said they were seen flying around the hotel. You should probably see for yourself." Puzzled, Star headed to the elevator and pressed the button to go down to the lobby. When she arrived on the ground floor, she noticed people gathered near the entrance, their faces filled with worry and apprehension. "What did those two get themselves into now?" she muttered, pushing past the crowd. As she reached the doors, her eyes widened at the scene unfolding before her. The street was in ruins. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The asphalt scorched, windows shattered, and cars wrecked beyond recognition. Some bodies were even protruding from the wreckage of the vehicles. Star stood frozen, her mouth agape, as she watched Tony dragging a man by his massive horns. With his other hand, he conjured a throne of silver-blue light, his movements slow and labored. His breath came in heavy gasps. "I'm just going to take a seat," he rasped, collapsing onto the glowing throne. As his mask retreated, Tony's face was revealed, streaked with dried blood, a deep cut along his lips, and bruises marring his skin. His eyes were drooping with exhaustion, his chest heaving as he slouched, still gripping the horn in his hand. Melissa appeared not far behind, her flight unsteady, as though she were drunk. She was dragging a man and a woman by the backs of their capes, her expression strained. Landing softly next to Tony, she tossed the two villains at his feet, then groaned as she slumped down beside the throne. Leaning her head back, she breathed heavily, her body clearly spent. Her mask slowly dissolved, revealing that she was in just as bad shape as Tony. Her hair was a mess, blood trickling down her nose, and her face twisted in pain. One hand clutched her side as she winced. Star walked out slowly, turning in place to take in the destruction. The bodies of villains lay strewn across the street, some piled atop each other. Despite the devastation, the hotel remained untouched, the only structure in the vicinity left in perfect condition. "Melissa," Tony called out between labored breaths. "Yeah," Melissa groaned, wincing. "You? All right? Not really. Ugh. Pretty sure I've got a broken rib. You? I can feel my heart beating in my ears and head. What is going on here?" Star demanded, her eyes wide with concern as she looked at the two of them. Tony, who had closed his eyes, opened one lazily. "Oh hey, Star. Hope you had a good night's sleep. Explain this to me. What is all of this?" Star's expression shifted to serious. "You should see the other guy." "Hey, UJH," Tony groaned, clutching his side. "Melissa, you're not the only one with a broken something. It seems." Melissa gritted her teeth, trying to control her breathing. "There's a bounty on the president." Tony's eyes fluttered open and shut as he finished for her. "Every single villain, assassin, and bounty hunter who's ever heard of it came to collect." "A bounty?" Star asked, stunned. 5 billion euros, they both replied in unison. Star's eyes widened as she processed the information. "And you two fought them off alone? No help?" "The bodyguards wanted to help," Melissa started. "I told them not to," Tony added, shaking his head, his disheveled hair falling over his eyes. "If we failed to keep the villains back, they'd be the last line of defense for the president. The heroes were useless," Melissa muttered bitterly. "They tried to help but only ended up getting in the way," Tony said, his tone frustrated. "They were overwhelmed so fast. We had to bust our asses saving them too." Melissa finished, her voice strained. Star rubbed her forehead. exasperated. "Why didn't you call me for help?" Tony flashed a tired, mischievous grin. "You were asleep. Didn't want to wake you. One of us had to be in good shape for the next day. So we didn't wake you," Melissa added, her eyes now closed. "Hey, Star," Tony called softly. "Yes? Catch us." "What?" Star was about to ask when she saw both Tony and Melissa close their eyes, losing consciousness simultaneously. The glowing throne beneath them vanished along with Tony's consciousness. Before their bodies could hit the ground, Star dashed forward, catching them just in time, preventing them from hitting the ground too hard. Star hoisted Tony and Melissa over her shoulders, her voice soft but determined. "You can rest now. Leave what's left to me," she said as she made her way back into the hotel. As she walked through the lobby, the crowd parted for her like the sea, heads bowing in respect and gratitude toward Tony and Melissa. Their sacrifice had not gone unnoticed. An older gentleman hurried toward Star, struggling with a heavy bag of luggage. "Excuse me," he called out in a thick accent. Star turned, slightly confused. "Yes, I am a doctor," the small man explained breathlessly. "Those two saved my life. They brought me here to the hotel to keep me safe from the villains. I owe them my life, and I would like to repay it by treating them." Star, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, smiled and nodded. "Thank you." She then carried Tony and Melissa into the elevator, making her way back to their rooms. Once there, Star gently laid them side by side on the bed. The doctor approached Tony first and paused, looking at their armor. "Is there a way to remove their suits? I can't properly treat them with those on." As if responding to his words, both suits retreated, revealing Tony and Melissa, now mostly bare. Star's expression hardened as she took in the sight of their bruised and battered bodies. The doctor, however, remained professional. He extended his hands over Tony, a soft bluish glow emanating from his palms as he waved them over his body. "What are you doing?" Star asked, her curiosity piqued. "I'm using my quirk. What's the American term? Body scanning, I believe. I'm assessing the extent of their injuries." "This is remarkable." The doctor trailed off, visibly impressed. "He's quirkless, yet his body is extraordinary," the doctor muttered, astonished. "He possesses peak human physiology, strong, incredibly strong, but he's severely injured. Broken bones, ribs, lacerations, and extreme physical and mental exhaustion." He then moved on to Melissa, performing the same scan. "She's in a similar condition, though her organs are bruised, especially around her stomach. Her physiology mirrors his in nearly every way. Both are at the absolute peak of human potential, even without a quirk." The doctor opened his bag and began pulling out first aid equipment. "Luckily, I never go anywhere without my supplies. I should be able to treat them," he said as he prepared to tend to their wounds. Third person's POV. The doctor finished wrapping Tony's bandages, tucking the last piece of blood-soaked cotton into his bag. After closing it up, he nodded. "Thank you for letting me repay my debt." Star shook her head. "I should be the one thanking you. I don't know how long it would have taken for another doctor to arrive if you hadn't been here. Their injuries were severe, and immediate care was essential. I only did what I thought was right. Now that my job is done, I shouldn't disturb you any longer. The young heroes need proper rest. I'll escort you out." Star nodded, leading the doctor to the door. The doctor gave her one final wave before stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, his friendly smile faded, replaced by an apathetic expression. He leaned against the wall, eyes cold. When he reached the ground floor, the smile returned as he stepped out, blending seamlessly with the bustle of the hotel. Outside, law enforcement officers were busy detaining unconscious villains. The doctor turned toward them, offering a slight bow as he spoke in Russian. "Thank you for your service." The officers, appreciating the rare acknowledgement, tipped their hats. But as the doctor walked away, he scoffed under his breath in Japanese. "I wasn't talking about you idiots." After walking a few blocks, he found a sleek black SUV parked on the side of the road. He climbed into the passenger seat, where a man with black hair and green eyes sat behind the wheel, glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Did you find out what you needed?" the man asked. The doctor opened a compartment beside him, pulling out a small case. He slid his fingers along the edge, revealing a pair of gloves that blended perfectly with his skin. Placing the glowing item back into the case, he nodded. "Yes," he said, adjusting his glasses. "And they are truly fascinating test subjects. I must admit, I still don't understand why the master set this up," the man replied. "Now that they're weakened, it's the perfect chance to take them out. Patience, young Seiki. Do not underestimate the master's ways." He was curious about their abilities, whether they were truly quirkless, or if that was just a front to keep their real powers hidden. If it were the latter, the master would have gladly taken Stark's quirk for himself. But that's not the case, is it? Seiki said flatly. It is not. Stark's inhuman genius is entirely authentic. What we've seen is the full potential of the human mind. No quirks involved. Stop praising him, Seiki muttered, his expression unreadable. He doesn't deserve it. The doctor opened his large bag, revealing a compartment filled with empty vials. Oh, but quite the contrary. Stark has reached the peak of what any human could achieve, quirk or no quirk. Drive, he ordered. Seiki sighed as he started the car, driving off while the doctor carefully secured the blood-soaked cottons inside the vials. You're missing the point, the doctor continued, examining the vials. I'm not just talking about Stark's mind. His body is stronger than any normal human's, even stronger than those with minor physical enhancement quirks. His body borders on superhuman. It's as if he was made to be the perfect human. Seiki rolled his eyes, already tired of the doctor's constant praise of Tony. He was ready to tune him out and focus on the road, until the doctor's next words caught his attention. I initially thought Stark was born with it, a random genetic mutation that explains his intellect and physical prowess. But he's not the only one. His little girlfriend shows the same signs. A genetic mutation in one person, not unheard of, but the same mutation in two unrelated people who just happen to be very close. That's more than coincidence. What exactly are you implying? Seiki asked, narrowing his eyes. The doctor chuckled, his mustache twitching as he spoke. Given Stark's known intelligence, it's not far-fetched to think he created something, a chemical enhancement perhaps, that pushed his body to its peak potential. It must have been safe enough for him to share with his girlfriend. From the scan I performed, his body is flawless. He's the epitome of health. Seiki's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he asked, Doctor, what exactly are you planning? The doctor smiled darkly. I plan to study their blood, isolate the components that enhance them, and replicate it. Stark may have unknowingly solved a problem humanity wasn't even aware of. But that's not all. Seiki raised an eyebrow, trying to keep his tone casual. What problem are you talking about? The doctor sighed. Haven't you read the notes I gave you? I haven't finished them, Seiki admitted. I'm referring to the quark singularity problem, the doctor explained, his voice growing more serious. As quarks evolve, they grow stronger with each generation. The human body struggles to keep up with this evolutionary process, and quarks become unstable, harder to control. Seiki frowned as he listened, trying to process the information. And you think Stark's formula could fix that? Precisely, the doctor nodded. If I can reverse engineer Stark's formula, it could strengthen the human body to the point where it adapts to any quirk it possesses, stabilizing even the most volatile abilities. He paused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully before adding, but that's only one part of my plan. The other involves using Stark's and S.H.I.E.L.D.'s blood to create the perfect clone, the ultimate vessel for the Master. By transferring the Master's quirk into this vessel, we would eliminate any struggle for dominance. A quirkless body that adapts itself perfectly to the Master's quirks. We wouldn't even need Shigaraki anymore. Seiki's eyes widened in shock. What? The doctor's expression turned cold. I've already said too much. Leaning back against the window frame, the doctor gave Seiki an apathetic smile. You'll keep this between us, won't you? Seiki knew it wasn't a question, it was a threat. He glanced at the doctor, then back at the road, nodding quietly. For his own safety, there was no other option. The doctor then began chuckling darkly to himself. We should really be thanking Stark here. He has helped the master in ways even I couldn't. Third person's POV. While later, Tony woke up with a groan, feeling like his body hurt all over. He propped himself up on his elbows and looked down at his body, which was covered in bandages. Despite the wrappings around his torso, arms, and legs, his muscular figure was still visible. He shifted to the side and sat on the edge of the bed with another groan. As he went to massage his forehead, trying to ease the headache, he realized that bandages were also wrapped around his forehead, mostly hidden by his hair. His movements and noise woke Melissa, who groaned as well and sat up on the opposite side of the bed. What happened? Melissa asked, resting a hand on her forehead. We were too badass. And this is the price for it, Tony smirked, which made Melissa scoff and roll her eyes. That's right, the villains, Melissa said, remembering how they ended up in this condition. Are you okay, Tony? Tony stood up and began stretching, but quickly held his side in pain. A little sore and in pain, but nothing a few hardcore drugs won't fix. You? Apart from looking like a mummy, I'd say I could be better, Melissa replied, tying her loose hair into a ponytail. They soon heard a knock on the door, causing them both to turn toward it. Come in, they said in unison. As the door opened, the first thing they saw was a trolley of food. I knew you two would wake up soon, so I ordered room service, Star and Stripes said, pushing the trolley toward them. Oh my God! You are simply the best, Tony exclaimed, immediately grabbing food and starting to eat. Melissa wasn't far behind, as they had spent the entire night fighting without eating anything. Star watched them with a smile. I can't tell you how proud I am of both of you. You just did, Tony said, his mouth full. Star smiled and shook her head. You fought just like I taught you. Even while battling villains, you focused on the safety of the civilians around you. She chuckled. Some were so grateful that they offered to help you in return. Tony paused, tilting his head in confusion. What do you mean by that? Like the old doctor you saved. He wanted to repay you too by providing first aid, Star explained, motioning up and down at their bandaged bodies. Tony slowly chewed as he turned to look at Melissa, who also looked back at him. She slowly pulled the spoon from her mouth, her brows furrowed in confusion. Tony set his plate down and, after a moment, looked back at Star, holding up a finger to signal her to wait, while his other finger hooked by his lips as he finished chewing. Then, with a baffled expression, he said, Star, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but what the hell are you talking about? First of all, language, Star said, shaking her head. And second, you remember the old man you saved? He mentioned that during the villain's attack, you led him back to the hotel for safety. He was so moved by your actions that he wanted to repay you by healing both of you. Tony pinched his fingers together and closed one eye, swaying his head playfully. There's just a tiny little small problem with what you just said, though. Star tilted her head in confusion, wondering what Tony was referring to. Tony's joking expression faded as his face turned serious. We've never saved any old man. Huh? What? Star blinked in surprise. Melissa stopped mid-bite and nodded in agreement, setting her plate down. Yeah, I remember helping a mother and her children, along with a man protecting his daughter. We led them to the hotel to keep them safe, but there was never any old man. So then, who? Star began, but Tony interrupted her. Star, Tony said, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. What did you just do? Melissa turned to Star, tilting her head. Did you even bother to check if his story was real? He seemed genuine, Star replied hesitantly. You believed him without even checking if his story was legit? Tony exclaimed. What's the matter with you? Star remained calm, her expression unreadable. Both of you were injured and needed immediate care. As my interns, you're my responsibility, so your safety was my top priority. I watched him closely while the doctor treated your wounds. If he had any bad intentions, I would have intervened. But that wasn't the case. He simply cleaned and treated your wounds, then left. Tony clicked his tongue, frustrated, and held out his fist. Playback. A holographic video appeared from his ring, replaying the scene. It showed the doctor calmly treating their wounds, with Star standing behind him. Her eyes narrowed as she observed his every move. The three of them watched closely, seeing nothing suspicious. The doctor cleaned and bandaged Tony's wounds, packed away the used cotton, and left. What? He just treated our wounds. Why would he lie about us saving him? Melissa asked, frowning. Friday, run a facial recognition scan on him and pull up everything you can find, Tony instructed, his eyes narrowing. That doctor. He's working for AFO, Tony thought as he rubbed his chin, deep in thought. Within moments, the image on the hologram changed as Friday began scanning the doctor's face. Based on what I've gathered, he's known as Dr. Tsubasa in Japan. However, it appears that this name is an alias. Friday's voice echoed through the room. That's not all, boss. Please take a look at this. The image split into two, showing an old security footage photo of the doctor and his current face. Notice anything different? Both Melissa and Star squinted at the images, then shook their heads. No. They look exactly the same, Melissa said. Exactly. These photos are a decade apart. Their eyes widened. What? How? He hasn't aged a day. Could it be a quirk? Melissa asked, rubbing her chin as thoughts raced through her mind. That's the most likely explanation, Friday confirmed. All for one, Melissa muttered, causing Tony and Star to turn toward her. That doctor isn't the only one who hasn't aged. FO hasn't either. He's been a thorn in Uncle Might's side since before he even became All Might. He's been alive for a very long time. It's likely that this doctor is working for All for One, Melissa said, her face serious. Are you sure? Star asked, still confused. Melissa's expression grew more intense. At first, it was just a gut feeling, but the Nomu, AFO needed someone with advanced medical expertise to create those things. The Nomu are biological weapons. AFO doesn't seem like the type to sit down and study biology, which means someone else is helping him. I'm almost certain that doctor is working for All for One. So what could the doctor want with the both of you? That still doesn't explain why he would lie and treat you, Star asked, still puzzled. Friday, rewind the clip, Tony instructed, his eyes narrowing as the footage played again. This time, they watched more closely. Look, he was checking to see if we had a quirk. Melissa snapped her fingers in sudden realization. That's it. They didn't believe you were that smart without some kind of quirk. They set all this up to test you to see if there was something special they could take. Maybe AFO planned to steal it for himself. But it still doesn't add up. AFO is in jail. They're probably planning his escape, Tony said grimly, zooming in on the bag with the bloody cotton. His expression darkened. And that's not all. Shit. Even Melissa cursed as the full weight of the situation hit her. He has our blood. This is bad. Really, really bad. Third person's POV. Friday, set a reminder, Tony said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. When we're older and Star possibly invites us out for a drink at a bar, remind me to decline. Who knows? The next time I wake up, I might find one of my kidneys has been sold on the black market. He shot a sharp glare at Star, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Star sighed heavily, clearly exasperated. Like I said before, Tony, your recovery was my priority above everything else. I didn't know the full extent of your condition or how bad your injuries were at the time. It was an honest mistake, and for that, I sincerely apologize. I let my guard down. Tony scoffed, turning his head away as if the sincerity was too much for him. Ugh, stop sounding so genuine. It's making it hard for me to stay mad at you, he muttered, his disgusted expression softening just slightly. With a sigh, Tony shifted his focus to his ring. Friday, any luck tracking them down? Sorry, boss. No luck. It seems they've upgraded their tech since the last time we encountered them, Friday replied calmly. Well, that's just fan-freaking-tastic, Tony shouted, throwing his hands in the air as he shot up from the bed. Of course they have. Why wouldn't they? Tony, you're still injured, Star began, her tone concerned. I really think it's best if you... This is where you zip it, Star. Tony interrupted, motioning for her to be quiet as he paced around the room, ruffling his hair in frustration. Star was taken aback by his sharp tone but decided to let it go, sensing how on edge Tony was. She remained quiet for a moment, though a question lingered on her mind. There's something I don't understand, Star ventured cautiously. Why do they need your blood? Do they have some kind of quirk that allows them to harm you through a connection with your blood? Melissa, sitting quietly nearby, glanced at Tony, unsure. Should we tell her? She asked, her expression uncertain. Still pacing, Tony waved her off without a word, signaling her to go ahead. Melissa turned back to Star with a slightly awkward expression. Well, you see, Tony developed this serum. It's enhanced everything about us, our strength, our intellect, everything. It even has the power to upgrade quirks. Star's eyes widened in shock. You created something like that? That's incredible. But what are the side effects? That's the thing, Melissa continued. There aren't any, at least none we've discovered so far. That's why it's so groundbreaking. Tony took the serum himself, and he gave me one as well. Star's expression grew serious as she processed the implications. So, now that they have your blood, they could potentially reverse engineer the serum. If they take it, they could become even more dangerous than they already are. She mumbled to herself, a solemn look crossing her face. How could a simple mistake spiral so out of control? Melissa stood up from her seat, stretching her arms. I need a bath. I'm sweaty, and we've got that meeting with the president in a few hours. Star immediately stepped forward, her expression firm. Oh no, you don't. You need rest. Both of you do. I'll handle the meeting with the president while you recover. Tony scoffed, turning to face Star. Yeah, no, we're going. That's the whole reason we came here. Remember? Look, Star started, her voice calm but insistent. I understand you're angry. Angry? Tony snapped, his voice rising with each word. Angry doesn't even begin to describe what I'm feeling right now. His hands balled into fists, veins bulging at his temples. I'm not going to just sit here, twiddling my thumbs, while there's a bounty on the president's head. That means he's still a target, which means I've got something to take out all this frustration on. Tony, you're injured, Star pressed, stepping closer. You'll be a liability, especially in your current state. You're not just a danger to yourself, but to others. That's why I'm suspending your internship until you fully recover. Tony's eyes narrowed dangerously as he turned to face her. Then who am I supposed to take all this anger out on? You? You're the one responsible for all of this, after all. Star's face hardened, her tone taking on an edge. Are you threatening me right now? I let the first few incidents slide because I understood I was in the wrong. But I won't have you talk to me like that, young man. I'm still your superior, so watch your mouth. Tony stepped closer, his fists clenched so tightly that his ring began to glow in response to his rising emotions. You're only my superior because I allow it, he growled. Why don't we take this outside and see who's really the superior one here? Star didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders, her eyes narrowing in return. It seems I've been too lenient with you. You've gotten far too arrogant for your own good. As your mentor, maybe I should give you a lesson on how to dial that arrogance back. A lesson one-on-one on humility. You said it yourself, Tony replied, his voice low and simmering. The internship is suspended. So right now we're just two people face to face working out our problems. And we both know Americans understand things better when we settle them with our fists. Melissa's frustration was palpable as she appeared beside them, wedging her hands between Tony and Star to force them apart. All right, that's enough from both of you, she snapped, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic sharpness. She turned to Tony, her hands pressing lightly against his chest to keep him from advancing further. Tony, I get it. You're angry, and so am I. We both trusted Star to take care of us, and we ended up in this mess. So trust me when I say, I completely understand how you're feeling right now. Her gaze then shifted to Star, her tone softening but still firm. And you're an adult. So act like it. I can see you're already beating yourself up over what happened. And Tony lashing out at you isn't making it any easier. But you're still responsible for keeping things professional and mature. You're the #1 hero, a role model. So be one. Melissa's eyes darted between the two of them, sensing the tension in the air. Both of you are letting your emotions run wild, and that's not going to solve anything. I think it's best if we all take a step back, cool off, and give each other some space before we say something we can't take back. Star's face softened as guilt flashed across her features. Melissa offered her a small, compassionate smile. Star, I think it's best if you leave us for now. We need some time alone to sort things out. Star nodded, her shoulders slumping as she bowed her head slightly. I'm sorry for how I acted. I should be setting a better example for you both, and instead, I've only made things worse. I sincerely apologize. Melissa acknowledged the apology with a nod, her eyes understanding, but Tony let out a bitter scoff from the side. Yeah, you should be sorry, he muttered as he turned and walked off. Tony! Melissa exclaimed in exasperation, watching him walk away. What? Tony shot back, grabbing an apple from a tray of food. You don't expect me to apologize, do you? I don't have anything to be sorry for. I meant every damn word I said. Melissa sighed, rubbing her temples. Tony, I'm not asking for an apology, but could you at least try to meet her halfway? She's extending an olive branch. Tony tossed the apple into the air, caught it, and took a bite, settling down on the couch. Well, she can stay halfway if she wants. Doesn't mean I have to. Melissa opened her mouth to say more, but Star raised a hand, cutting her off. It's fine, Star said quietly, her voice laced with defeat. I understand. He's still upset. I'll give you both the space you need. As she turned to leave, Tony called after her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Tony! Melissa yelled, her patience wearing thin. Star paused but shook her head, closing the door quietly behind her without another word. The tension that lingered in the room was thick, heavy, and far from resolved. Third person's POV. Melissa stood with her hands on her hips, her expression a mix of exasperation and concern. Come on, Tony, was that really necessary? She asked. Yes it was, Tony replied, his tone still sharp, biting into his apple with a small scoff. Melissa sighed, shaking her head. I think you're misplacing your anger. What Star did was wrong. Sure, but she had good intentions. Does it look like I care what her intentions were? Tony shot back, his eyes meeting hers with a hard expression. Now you're just being childish, Melissa muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. Look, I know you're mad at Star, but being angry isn't going to fix anything. You know that. We just have to keep doing what we've always done. Prepare for the worst, adapt, and move forward. Tony exhaled sharply, his body relaxing slightly as the weight of her words sank in. I hate when you're right. Melissa raised an eyebrow, hands on her hips. What's that supposed to mean? And why do you hate it? Because it means I was wrong, and I'm never wrong, Tony replied with a smirk, tossing the rest of the apple into the trash. He clicked his tongue as he started unwrapping the bandages from his forehead and carelessly threw them aside. Where are you going now? Melissa asked, concern flickering across her face as she watched him walk away. To take a nice, long, warm bath. Maybe drown myself so I don't have to deal with this anymore. Tony mumbled over his shoulder. Okay, now you're exaggerating, she replied, rolling her eyes. Tony. Oh, for God's sake, Melissa muttered, shaking her head before following him toward the bathroom. She stood by as Tony began to undo the bandages around his hand, his face serious and distant as he absent-mindedly twirled his fingers. Melissa sighed, concern deepening, and started unwrapping her own bandages. Tony noticed the sound of the bandages coming off and turned to her, confused. What are you doing? Melissa glanced at him with a playful smile. What does it look like? I'm joining you so you don't drown. Tony let out a small chuckle. I was joking about that. Can't take any chances, Melissa teased. Now arms up, Lift them up, she repeated, her tone patient. Tony complied, raising his arms, and Melissa carefully began to unwind the bandages from his torso. Once she finished, Tony did the same for her, though she shyly covered herself as best she could with her hands. Tony rolled his eyes. Really? What are you hiding? It's not like I haven't seen everything. It's still embarrassing, Melissa muttered, blushing lightly. Tony just shook his head, amused, as he turned toward the tub, which was already filled with warm water. He let out a contented sigh as he slid into the bath, the heat instantly soothing him. This might be better than sex, he mumbled to himself. Oh, really? Melissa teased, arching an eyebrow as she tied her hair into a messy bun and slipped into the tub, her back toward Tony. You might just be right, Tony chuckled as she leaned against him. It's one thing for me to agree, but it's another for you to agree as well. Melissa giggled, resting her head on his chest. Right? I forgot how fragile the male ego is. She tilted her head back and kissed his cheek softly. Nothing is better than sex with you. There, happy? Tony smirked, his eyes closed as he stretched his arms across the tub. It would have been better if you didn't add that last part. Was that really necessary? Melissa smiled, her own eyes closing as she relaxed against him. Maybe, but you know I mean it. Together, they soaked in the silence, both finding comfort in the warmth of the bath and each other's presence, their earlier frustrations melting away. The bath might have been soothing their bodies, but the weight of their unresolved problems still lingered in the air, refusing to be fully washed away. Melissa had her face half submerged in the water, lazily blowing bubbles before speaking through them. So ba ak se gyong to adu? Her words came out garbled and incoherent. Tony tilted his head, raising an eyebrow. Lifting her head from the water, Melissa repeated, I said, so what are we going to do? Tony sighed, his mind still whirling with the possibilities. That's a very good question. Honestly, I'm still thinking. Maybe we'll find them and then I'll have Friday send an orbital laser strike from space, obliterate everything so there are no leads that trace back to us. That's the option I'm leaning toward right now. Tony, I'm being serious here, Melissa groaned. Tony turned his head to her, the faintest trace of a smirk playing on his lips. Who says I'm not? With both of our blood, they could clone us. That's something I really hope doesn't happen. So before it does, I'll destroy everything. Melissa sank lower into the water, blowing a raspberry in frustration. Ugh, I didn't even think about clones. That would be a whole other problem. Tell me about it, Tony muttered, rubbing his temples. Suddenly, Melissa perked up and turned to face him, a mischievous glint in her eye. Say, if they made a clone using both of our blood, would that technically be considered our child? Tony groaned. Melissa, please don't even go there. That's another headache waiting to happen. I don't even want to think about it. Melissa wasn't deterred. I mean, would we just abandon it because it's a clone made in a lab? It'd still be made from our DNA, a completely different genetic makeup, so it wouldn't even be just a clone. It'd be our child, right? Tony, without opening his eyes, reached out and covered her mouth to stop the train of thought. He had enough on his plate already, and this was the last thing he needed to consider. When he peeked to see if she'd stopped, he regretted it. Melissa was looking up at him with sad, wide eyes, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. He sighed heavily, his resolve weakening. He slowly moved his hand away. Would you really abandon it if it came to be? She asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Tony leaned in and kissed the side of her head, his lips lingering there for a moment. You're thinking too deeply into this, he murmured. Nothing's happened yet. There's no clone, there's no decoded serum, and it'll take them a long time to isolate anything from our blood. You're only hurting yourself by worrying about something that doesn't exist. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, resting his chin on the top of her messy bun. Melissa melted into the embrace. She turned around and vegan holding onto him tightly, her concerns still lingering in the back of her mind but soothed for now. But Tony's eyes grew cold as he held her. A steely, emotionless look crossed his face, a silent promise flickering behind his gaze. Just for making her feel this way, I won't hesitate to obliterate them all. Whoever is responsible. They can all burn. For all I care, they can go to hell, and I would personally escort them there. Third person's POV. Melissa was still hugging Tony as they sat on the bathtub. Steam was still rising between them as they treated it like a sauna. This is seriously so nice, Melissa muttered as her arms went up and wrapped themselves around Tony's neck, resting her head on his shoulders. Tony's hands subconsciously went down her back, his fingers tracing her skin. I get what you mean. I feel like staying here for hours. It's our little escape from reality. She hummed as she inhaled his scent and began tracing his jaw softly with her fingers. Her fingers softly moved from his chin to his cheek, which she began to caress with care and love. Melissa turned his head and made him look towards her, their faces now really close, pressing against each other without really kissing each other. Hey, Tony. Tony hummed softly, basking in her closeness and scent. I love you. Tony couldn't help but chuckled. And where's this coming from? Melissa giggled as well, her fingers now tracing his lips. I don't know. I sometimes get this feelings where they become too much, and I have to tell you. Tony pressed his forehead against hers. Well, I love you more, he said with a growing smile. Oh, really now? She said teasingly, her own smile growing. She went back to caressing his cheek and brought him closer. I wonder how much, she said as she pecked his lips. Tony kissed her back. I love you 3,000. Oh, 3,000. That's a big number, Melissa said, chuckling as she began to kiss him. Tony's other hand grabbed the side of her face as he brought her closer, deepening their kiss. Both closing their eyes, savoring each other's taste, the hot water making them hot as well. They parted a bit, their breaths mingling, their bodies hot and their faces flushed. They couldn't help but smile at each other. Their kiss became more passionate and heated, Tony's hands now caressing her sides while her own fingers tangled themselves on his hair, both moaning as their bodies pressed together. Melissa suddenly felt one of Tony's hands move from her waist to her ass, the other on her thigh. She parted their kiss, their faces flushed, their eyes glazed and their breaths ragged. She looked down and saw Tony's hard-on pointing at her. They stayed there, panting, their foreheads against each other. Her fingers moved and softly caressed his face, tracing his skin, his eyes, his nose, and his lips. His hands traced her back, her arms and her breasts. Their breathing finally settled and their minds cleared. They both smiled at each other and kissed passionately. Both of them lost in the pleasure, making them forget about their problems, leaving it for their future selves to deal with as it wasn't their problem currently. Third person's POV. Melissa stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her purple lantern ring glowing softly on her finger. She was dressed comfortably in a loose tank top and silk shorts, her damp hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. Around her floated intricate purple constructs, blow dryers and combs, skillfully drying and styling her hair. The gentle hum of the constructs filled the room as warm air swept through her locks, causing her to smile. Glancing at her ring, Melissa smirked. This thing is actually pretty useful, she muttered, admiring the seamless efficiency. Suddenly, her expression turned thoughtful. Purple hands, shimmering with energy, appeared behind her and quickly set to work. Each one grabbed a section of her hair, twisting and twirling it with precision until a single long, neat braid formed. She tossed it over her shoulder, inspecting the result with satisfaction. Nice, she praised herself, grinning at her reflection before dissipating the constructs with a flick of her wrist. She left the bathroom, crossing the hall back into the bedroom. Inside, Tony was sitting on the bed, shirtless, wearing only a pair of loose-fitting pants. He sat cross-legged, deeply engrossed in his work. Silver blue constructs, keyboards and floating computer screens surrounded him, casting a faint glow across the room. His brow was furrowed in concentration as his fingers danced over the holographic keyboards, typing rapidly, while his sharp eyes scanned the information on the monitors. Does that even work? Melissa asked, leaning against the doorway with a curious tilt to her head. Tony hummed in confirmation, his focus unwavering. Friday is connected to the ring. Anything I type, she receives, sends back to her main computer for storage, and vice versa. She can display information for me through the ring too. Melissa crossed her arms, impressed. So, you basically have a portable computer with everything you need wherever you go. Tony nodded without missing a beat, eyes still glued to the screen. Melissa looked down at her own ring, pondering. Wait, so does that mean Jarvis is in this ring as well? A familiar British voice echoed from the ring. I am always at your service, madam. Melissa hummed, nodding with satisfaction. Good to know. She glanced back at Tony, watching him work. So, what exactly are you doing? Building a lock on our DNA, Tony explained, not looking up. It'll seal our DNA so that if someone tries to take it, it'll be dead the moment it leaves our bodies. Melissa blinked, intrigued. Wait, you're making a device, or? Tony's fingers paused for a brief moment. Not a device, no. I'm developing a virus, a harmless one that bonds with our DNA. Once it's disconnected from us, both the virus and our DNA won't survive. He stopped, his fingers still hovering over the keyboard as his mind worked through something deeper. Melissa noticed the sudden shift in his expression and grinned. Tony's having a brilliant idea, she teased, knowing that look all too well. Tony suddenly stood up, pacing back and forth across the room, his hand rubbing his chin. Bonding with our DNA, he muttered, deep in thought, his eyes distant. Could do more than just protect us. It could enhance regeneration. Lock our DNA so it's completely useless outside our bodies. Melissa, now sitting cross-legged on the bed, watched him with a playful smile, bouncing her legs up and down. Ooh, I love it when you get like this. It means something amazing is about to happen. Tony snapped his fingers, his eyes lighting up. Friday, discard the current project. Scrap it all. Boss, are you sure? Friday's voice chimed in cautiously. Scrap it, Tony repeated, more animated now. I've got something better than that virus idea. Are you absolutely certain? We've already made significant progress. Positive, Tony said, his confidence unwavering. Understood. Deleting all files. Friday's voice echoed as the arc reactor logo spun on the screen before being replaced by the message. No files available. Tony cracked his knuckles, excitement radiating from him. Now, I want everything you can find on symbiotic relationships, DNA bonding, molecular integration, and biological hosts, down to the smallest details. That's a broad range of topics, Friday noted. Yeah, but I want every angle, from nature to cutting-edge science, Tony continued, pacing the room. Look for anything on adaptive biology, especially how foreign organisms can interact with and augment host DNA. Understood, boss, Friday responded as the search began. Various text and data flashed across the conjured screens, Tony's eyes scanning rapidly, absorbing the information as it streamed by. His mind was already racing with possibilities. Now I'm really curious about what that genius mind of yours is thinking right now. Tony, Melissa said with a smile, watching him work intently. I'm practically already making Mark 43. In a way, Tony explained, eyes never leaving the screens. But this one, it's more of a biological weapon than a suit. And I take it it's going to bond with our biology, based on what you asked Friday to gather? Melissa asked, her smile fading slightly as she pieced it together. Yup, Tony nodded. I'm building a living suit of armor. That sounds really dangerous and like a bad idea, Melissa said, her tone shifting to concern. That could go wrong on so many levels. Really don't need the negativity right now. Love, Tony replied, not missing a beat. I'm not being negative. I'm being realistic, Melissa countered. I'm here to help, and part of that is stopping you when I think you're taking things too far. You're anxious and worried, which I understand, but those feelings? They don't mix well with science. They lead to mistakes. Tony was silent for a moment, clearly processing her words. Melissa rolled her eyes gently. I'm not telling you to stop, Tony. I'm just asking you to be extra careful. You're running on emotion right now, and we agreed messing with life, especially at this level, isn't something to rush into. Tony let out a soft sigh, hearing the concern in her voice. I promise you, I'll be really careful. And that's all I ask of you, Melissa nodded, satisfied. So, have you thought of a name for this project of yours? Yes. Tony paused for a moment, a determined look on his face. I'll call it Project Symbiote. Third person's POV. Melissa lay sprawled out on the bed, arms and legs spread wide as she gazed at the ceiling. A look of utter boredom plastered across her face. She huffed, exasperated, her fingers tapping against the bed rhythmically. In front of her, Tony stood with his hand on his chin, deep in thought. His mind raced as he considered his next project. Should I go full liquid metal symbiote? He mused. No, I promised Melissa I'd be more careful. Better to start with a regular biological symbiote, something manageable. Once I figure out the symbiote aspect, I can work on perfecting it. If it turns out bad, I can just destroy it before it develops consciousness. His thoughts were interrupted by Melissa's tired voice, snapping him back to reality. Hey, Tony, she said, her tone drenched in exhaustion. Tony glanced over at her, his eyebrows raised. Yeah, he responded, seeing the way she looked seconds away from dying of sheer boredom. What are we still doing here? Melissa asked, propping herself up on her elbows. Star put the internship on hold, and tomorrow's our last day. So what's the point of us staying here? Wouldn't it make more sense to send us home? Tony furrowed his brow. Wouldn't it look bad if we just up and left without saying anything to the president? He asked, though he sounded unsure himself. Melissa let out a groan and rolled her eyes. Look bad? Tony, we literally risked our lives to protect him. If anything, he should be giving us a Medal of Honor, not keeping us here like this, she grumbled, clearly irritated. Friday, call Star, Tony instructed, and one of the room's large screens flickered to life, showing a ringing video call. After a few moments, Star's face appeared on the screen, seated in what looked like a car. Tony? Star asked, tilting her head, clearly confused. Is something the matter? Tony sighed heavily, his voice tired. Star. What the hell are we still doing here? His usual energy was drained, his frustration evident. Melissa rolled over to the edge of the bed so Star could see her too, her face equally filled with boredom. Star blinked, trying to process the question. What do you mean? Tony exhaled sharply. Why are we still here? If we're too injured to continue the internship, why not just send us home instead of keeping us on house arrest? Before Star could answer, another voice interrupted from off-screen. HM? Is that young Stark? Pass me the phone. I have a few words for him, said a familiar voice, one that belonged to none other than the president himself. Star shifted the camera, and the screen revealed President Jonathan sitting beside his wife. His expression was calm but serious. Mr. Stark, the president nodded in acknowledgement. Mr. President, Tony responded with a respectful nod, arms crossed, his expression stoic. The president smiled kindly. First of all, on behalf of the United States of America, I want to thank you for your service. Star, along with my security, has informed me of what you and Ms. Shields did to ensure my wife and I were kept safe. Your bravery is greatly appreciated, and I want you to know that once this situation is resolved, you will both be highly compensated for your efforts. Melissa, now sitting upright at the edge of the bed, listened intently, her previous boredom now replaced with curiosity. I wanted to personally thank you earlier, but I was told that you both needed rest, the president continued. It's unfortunate that your trip had to end this way. I had hoped you could have joined us, but given the circumstances, that isn't possible. That said, I am officially relieving both you and Ms. Shields of your duties. You are free to return home and recover as you see fit. Tony nodded appreciatively. Thank you, Mr. President. It's a shame we have to cut this short, but we understand. The president gave him a warm smile. I hope this experience doesn't deter you from future collaborations with us. Tony grinned, flashing 2 thumbs up. Nah, I'd be losing out on profit if I did that. And we both know I'm all about that money. Melissa groaned, rolling her eyes before playfully kicking him in the backside. Tony, seriously? The president burst into hearty laughter at Tony's comment, wiping a tear from his eye. "Ah, I needed that. I truly hope you two make a full and swift recovery." Both Tony and Melissa gave small, respectful bows, their time in Japan influencing their mannerisms. The president handed the phone back to Starr, who was about to speak when Tony snapped his fingers, ending the call abruptly. "Tony," Melissa raised an eyebrow, looking at him incredulously. She was about to say something. "Did you really have to hang up?" Tony shrugged nonchalantly. "HM? Was she? Didn't notice." Melissa gave him a disapproving look. Being nice and forgiving wouldn't kill you." Tony smirked smugly. "Neither does being petty. So, I'll be as petty as I please." Melissa sighed and rolled her eyes at Tony's smug response, leaning back against the bed again. "You're impossible sometimes. You know that?" Tony just grinned, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. "And yet, here you are, putting up with me." She smirked at him, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, you're lucky you're cute." Tony raised an eyebrow. "I'll take that as a compliment." Melissa laughed softly before stretching out on the bed once more, her earlier boredom slowly fading after the call with the president. "So, we're going home now, right?" "Yep, all we need to do is pack and we'll be ready to go," Tony said, pushing himself off the wall and looking around the room. "Finally, no more being cooped up like prisoners. I can actually get back to working on the project." After changing into something less revealing, Tony and Melissa packed their clothes into their luggage. Once everything was ready, Tony walked toward the window, suitcase in hand. "Where are you going?" Melissa asked, watching him curiously. With a smirk, Tony put on his lantern suit and pointed upward toward the roof. "We're heading up." Melissa frowned. "Are we seriously flying while carrying all this?" "The suitcases would burn from the friction." Tony chuckled confidently. "Melissa, you're forgetting that since we fly, we also own a jet capable of going beyond hypersonic." Melissa blinked, realization dawning on her. "Ah, right." With that, they both flew out of the hotel window and up to the roof, where they landed on a helipad. Setting their luggage down, Tony held out his ring. "Friday, bring forth the Stark jet." Melissa raised an eyebrow, giving Tony a weird look. "The Stark jet?" Tony shrugged. "Yeah, what else would I call it?" Melissa scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I should start naming my inventions Shield this and Shield that." Tony made a face of distaste. "Shield this, and that sounds like a horrible name." Melissa playfully glared at him. "Tony, as much as I love you, you really know how to get under my skin sometimes. You're lucky I don't punch you." Tony just grinned, clearly enjoying the banter. A moment later, they noticed a ripple in the sky as the Stark jet descended onto the helipad, its thrusters aimed down. They boarded, secured their luggage, and strapped themselves in. Tony sighed contentedly. "Now let's go home. I miss my Baymax." With that, the jet blasted off into the sky, carrying them swiftly toward home. Third person's POV. Tony and Melissa were soaring through the sky in their jet, the hum of the powerful engines barely masking the intensity of the ride. The horizon blurred as they flew at dizzying speeds, leaving the clouds behind in streaks. Tony grinned, his hands expertly guiding the jet through wild loops and spirals, as the aircraft twirled like a playful top. Melissa, gripping her seat with white knuckles, glanced over at Tony with a mix of amusement and concern. "Is all this really necessary?" she asked, her voice raised to be heard over the hum of the engine and the wind whipping outside. Tony smirked, his eyes gleaming with that familiar mischievous spark. "But of course," he replied smugly, pulling the jet into a sharp dive. They skimmed just above the surface of the ocean, the water splitting apart beneath them, roaring in protest as the force of their descent cut through the waves. "This is how I blow off steam, baby." He pulled back on the controls, and the jet shot upward in a dizzying ascent, the air around them shimmering with the sheer speed of their motion. A swirling vortex of clouds formed as they broke through the atmosphere. Tony pushed the controls forward, leveling the jet out in one smooth motion before blasting them ahead at full throttle. As they flew, the sky darkened around them, a stark contrast to the bright morning light they'd left behind just minutes ago. The rapid shift in time zones was dizzying, the world seeming to move faster than they could track. Tony hit a button on the control panel, causing the boosters to roar to life and propel them forward even faster. The landscape below became a blur as they approached Japan at breakneck speed. Soon, they were flying over the familiar coastline, the sprawling beach beneath them marked by the towering cliffs where their home was nestled. "Open up, Friday," Tony commanded, his voice calm despite the intense flight. The cliffs responded, a hidden runway revealing itself as the rock face slid open. Tony switched to autopilot, allowing Friday to take control and guide the jet safely into the hangar hidden within the cliffside. The aircraft glided smoothly down the runway before coming to a gentle stop as the rock sealed behind them once more. The hatch of the jet opened with a soft hiss, and Tony and Melissa stepped out, both carrying their bags. Tony took a deep breath, stretching his arms wide as he grinned. "Home sweet home. Oh, how I missed you." Melissa rolled her eyes, chuckling softly. "You're ridiculous." She reached for his bags, extending her hand expectantly. "Come on, give them to me." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Whoa, girl. Chill, we just got home," he teased, making a calming motion with his hands. Melissa slapped his arm with a playful but firm smack. "I meant your bags, genius. I'll put everything away, right?" "Thanks," Tony said sheepishly, handing over his luggage. Scoffing, Melissa disappeared to organize their things while Tony made his way into the lab. Once inside, he called out, "Friday, I need you to place an order. What would you like, boss?" Friday's voice replied, as smooth and efficient as ever. "I need you to get me some experimental rats," Tony said, clasping his hands together in mock apology. "Forgive me, Principal Nizu, but this is for science." "Consider it done, boss," Friday replied. Tony paused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Wait a minute. How long do you think it would take us to design a virtual reality helmet that can manipulate time perception?" "Boss, I believe we already have everything necessary," Friday responded without hesitation. "You just haven't built it yet. With our current VR training room, your research on neuroscience, and the assistance of the microbots, I can design the helmet within minutes. Shall I proceed? And should I still place the order for the experimental subjects?" Tony grinned, his eyes lighting up. "Sure, Friday. Be creative. I'll grab a drink in the meantime." "As you wish, boss. I'll begin immediately," Friday confirmed as Tony left the lab, stretching his arms with a satisfied sigh. Later, when Melissa returned from organizing their bags, she found Tony in the kitchen, mixing something up. She raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing now?" Tony emerged from behind the counter, holding 2 milkshakes. He handed her the pink one with a grin. "I was craving something sweet, so I made us milkshakes. Strawberry for you." Melissa's eyes lit up as she took the drink. "Oh, thanks." She took a sip, but her expression quickly changed. She pulled the straw from her mouth, holding her hand under it to catch any spills. "Is there alcohol in this?" Tony, sipping his chocolate milkshake with a smirk, nodded. "Yup." Melissa gulped it down, sticking her tongue out in disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Tony shrugged, his grin widening. "Felt adventurous. It's actually pretty good, right?" Melissa huffed, glaring at him before taking another, more cautious sip. She smacked her lips, her expression softening. "Okay, it's not bad now that I know what to expect. It just caught me off guard." Tony raised his glass with a playful wink. "To adventure, you're a terrible influence," Tony, Melissa sighed, shaking her head as she watched him make his way back to the lab. She couldn't help but follow, her milkshake still in hand. "Relax," Tony replied with a smirk. "Alcohol isn't even that bad for us. With our enhanced metabolism, we can't get drunk, remember?" Melissa sighed again, this time more dramatically. "My boyfriend is turning into a raging alcoholic and dragging me down with him," she said in mock seriousness, taking another sip from her spiked milkshake. Tony chuckled as they descended into the lab. "Raging? That's a bit harsh. It's literally my first time drinking. And no one's forcing you." You could put that cup down if you wanted. Melissa glanced at her drink, then took another long sip. No thanks. Even though it's cold, I like the warmth it gives my chest, she said with a contented smile, swirling her straw idly. Tony scoffed, taking a gulp of his own drink. And you call me the raging alcoholic. Hypocrite. They entered the lab, where the microbots were busy shifting and moving around one of the workstations. The tiny machines moved with a fluid precision, assembling something piece by piece, the soft hum of their mechanics filling the space. What are you making? Melissa asked, intrigued by the activity. It's not me, Tony said, leaning casually against the counter. I gave Friday free rein on this project. Okay, so what is Friday making? Melissa asked, raising an eyebrow. Friday's voice chimed in smoothly. I was tasked with creating a virtual reality helmet that would take your consciousness and transport it into a virtual space where your perception of time is altered. However, I made a few adjustments. Instead of a helmet, I've designed glasses with the same effect. The microbots parted, revealing two thick, futuristic visors shaped like glasses. They were sleek and dark, wrapping around the eyes and almost encasing the wearer's entire upper face. I designed them for easy transport, so you can use them whenever you need a quick brainstorming session or immersive experience, Friday explained. Melissa picked up one of the visors, examining it closely. These look pretty slick, she said, turning it over in her hands. So we just put these on and time inside the virtual world moves differently? Exactly, Friday confirmed. Your mind perceives time at an accelerated or decelerated rate, depending on the settings. It can help with simulations, creativity, or even training. Third person's POV, both Tony and Melissa sat at their workstations, slipping on their sleek VR visors. The moment they pressed the sides, a soft glow illuminated the lenses, and their surroundings flickered, immersing them into a new world. As the VR system booted up, Tony smirked to himself. Man, doing this makes me feel like Cyclops, Tony mused. Melissa, still in awe, looked around at the vast, white emptiness surrounding them. This is kinda cool, she whispered, moving her fingers in and out of fists. She marveled at how real it all felt. I can barely tell the difference. Feels so lifelike. Tony, ever the skeptic, pinched his own cheeks and let the skin snap back into place. He nodded in satisfaction. Not bad, Friday. You've really outdone yourself. Thank you, boss. Your praises are more than welcomed, Friday's voice echoed all around them, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Tony glanced out at the endless white void, a mischievous grin forming on his face. God, is that you? He called out. Yes, my child, Friday responded playfully, perfectly in sync with Tony's humor. Both Tony and Melissa chuckled at the playful banter, but Melissa quickly refocused. Do you think we could sell this in Stark Industries? She asked, glancing at Tony curiously. Tony shook his head, the weight of the potential headaches already looming over him. Honestly, I'd rather not, he replied, rubbing his temple. It's a fast-track way to get sued. Imagine someone dying while wearing these things. Guess who would get blamed? They'd paint us as murderers, and the lawsuits would pile up. Not to mention, it would drag down our credibility. Melissa blinked, not quite understanding the full concern. Since when has getting sued over our tech ever not been a thing? I mean, we had tons of lawsuits back when Stark Industries first launched our products, she countered, crossing her arms. Tony raised an eyebrow. Fair point, but I'm just not in the mood to deal with it right now. Besides, VR tech isn't exactly groundbreaking in this Quark-dominated era. Yes, but none of them have Stark quality, Melissa pointed out. And VR hasn't really taken off. Most of the games focus on heroes and it's gotten repetitive. Tony sighed, true enough. Fine, go ahead if you want to push it forward. But you're on your own with this one. I've got my hands full with the symbiote project. Melissa gave him a playful scoff. Since when have you ever dealt with the day-to-day business stuff anyway? You always leave that to me. Touché, Tony said with a shrug, not arguing the point. Melissa turned her gaze upwards. Friday, could you transport me to another server? I've got work to do, and I don't want to distract Tony. Of course, Miss Melissa, Friday replied smoothly. A soft, white light enveloped Melissa, and in an instant, she disappeared from the blank space, leaving Tony alone in the simulated void. Tony stood there for a moment, taking in the empty white world. All right, Friday, reconstruct our lab. Exact model. The sterile white floor beneath Tony's feet shifted, gradually taking on the appearance of sleek metal, the familiar contours of his lab forming around him. Workbenches, screens, tools, and equipment materialized until it felt like he had never left the real world. Perfect, Tony muttered, admiring the detail. Now, bring up everything we've got on Project Symbiote. Multiple holographic screens sprang into existence around him, filled with streams of data, DNA sequences, and research notes. Tony sat cross-legged on his chair, spinning slowly as he scanned through the information. He grabbed a rotating 3D model of a DNA helix, pulling it closer for a more detailed examination. All right, Tony muttered, zooming in on various segments of the DNA strands. He flicked away a few strands that didn't seem relevant. A symbiote shouldn't be able to survive without a host. It's nothing on its own, completely dependent on its host for survival. He frowned, contemplating the complexities of the symbiote's biology. He continued to tweak the DNA projections, his mind racing with possibilities. Tony murmured to himself, there has to be a flaw in its design, something we can exploit or enhance. The VR lab was silent except for the occasional beeping of virtual instruments and Tony's thoughtful muttering. Every detail of the symbiote's biology was laid out before him, yet the answer remained elusive. Tony stretched his arms, feeling the stiffness from hours of focus in the VR lab. He took off his visor, blinking a few times to adjust to reality. Friday, how long was I in there? 30 minutes, boss, Friday replied smoothly. Tony raised an eyebrow, surprised. It had felt like hours. Not bad. Have the test subjects arrived? Yes. Baymax received them and is currently tending to their basic needs, Friday reported. Good, Tony nodded. Let's start with SYB-01. Get the energy converter set up with the cradle. That should allow us to generate the proper living tissues. As Tony gave the command, his microbots buzzed to life, swarming around him before lifting him toward the biological section of the lab. He floated gently over to the upgraded cradle, the same one that had once helped All Might restore his damaged organs. The microbots carried the energy converter, the transfigured device that allowed Tony to generate elements from the periodic table with precise control. The swarm of microbots converged on the cradle, disassembling it with rapid precision, integrating the converter into its framework. Piece by piece, the cradle morphed and upgraded, forming a more advanced version that could seamlessly combine energy conversion with biological regeneration. Watching the process unfold, Tony slapped his forehead, realization dawning. That's right, the techno-vision. I could have used it to upgrade the cradle in the first place. Friday's voice chimed in with a hint of amusement. No need to worry, boss. I already anticipated that. The techno-vision's coding is part of my system now. I was able to analyze the cradle and implement several optimizations while you were busy. Tony's eyes lit up with excitement. Erg! Friday, if you were physically here, I'd kiss you, he shouted. His fists clenched in exhilaration as he looked up in triumph. Heh! Tony lifted an eyebrow. Was that smugness I hear from you? I don't know what you are referring to, boss. I am an A.I. I don't experience smugness, Friday replied robotically. Yeah, alright, Tony scoffed, third person's POV. Synthesis for the SYB-01 is complete. Boss. We should now begin the bonding process with subject 01, Friday informed Tony, her voice calm but with an edge of anticipation. Has Baymax already secured the subject in the experimental section? Tony asked, glancing up from his holographic display. Yes, boss. The subject is in place and ready for the procedure. Good, Tony said, leaning back in his chair. Have Baymax bring the SYB-01. I'm not getting anywhere near that thing until I know it's safe, he added with a smirk, only half joking. A few moments later, the lab doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Baymax waddled in, holding an empty metal and glass cylinder in his wide, plush arms. Baymax moved methodically toward the cradle, a specialized containment unit, and inserted the cylinder into a slot on the side. With a deliberate twist, a loud hiss escaped from the cylinder as white vapor seeped out. Baymax gently removed the outer casing, revealing the black goo inside, which slithered and writhed as if eager to be freed. Tony stood up, nodding at Baymax to follow him. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, leading the way to a viewing area that overlooked a sterile containment room. Inside, a small mouse scurried nervously around the enclosure, its tiny whiskers twitching. Tony positioned himself by the observation window, his eyes fixed on the scene below. "Baymax, begin the process." On the far side of the room, a metal hatch opened, revealing a perfect circular port for the cylinder. Baymax inserted the container and secured it with another twist. The hatch locked, and with a mechanical click, the cylinder opened, releasing the SYB-01. The black goo slid out, hitting the ground with a wet slap. "SYB-01 has been released," Friday began narrating. "It appears to be searching for its host. Subject 01, the mouse, seems hesitant. Likely an instinctual reaction to the presence of SYB-01. The black substance slowly advanced toward the mouse, which cowered in the corner, its tiny paws trembling. The symbiote, almost predatory in its movements, closed in, tendrils reaching out. SYB-01 is making contact," Friday continued. "Bonding process initiating." Suddenly, the mouse let out a high-pitched screech, a sound so piercing that it made Tony flinch. But what caught his attention even more was the second, deeper tone overlapping with the mouse's cry. An eerie, inhuman sound that sent a chill down his spine. The symbiote began merging with the mouse, but the process wasn't smooth. Blood started to drip from the mouse's eyes, nose, and mouth. Its tiny limbs contorted unnaturally, bones cracking and twisting at odd angles. The mouse's tail whipped violently, smacking against the floor as it struggled in agony. Tony's brow furrowed as he watched the grotesque transformation. The mouse let out one final, gurgling scream before it exploded in a spray of blood and tissue. The symbiote at its core, now drenched in gore, quivering on the floor amidst the remains. Tony stared at the mess for a long moment, the silence in the lab thick and heavy. "Well, I'm sure glad I didn't use me in that bonding process, right, Friday?" he quipped, trying to inject some levity into the grim situation. The only response was an awkward silence. "Burn it," Tony commanded, his voice flat. Immediately, flamethrowers descended from the ceiling of the containment room, their tips glowing a menacing orange. For a split second, Tony swore he saw the symbiote twitch in a way that almost resembled fear. Before it could react, it was engulfed in flames from every angle, incinerating it along with the remnants of the mouse. The fire roared for several seconds before fading, leaving only ashes behind. "Well, that was something," Tony exhaled slowly. "What went wrong, Friday?" "The bonding process overwhelmed Subject 01's DNA. It couldn't handle the stress of the symbiote's integration. The result was cellular breakdown, leading to the explosive failure you just witnessed." "Yeah, I noticed," Tony sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Back to the drawing board, I guess." He gave Baymax a reassuring pat on his soft, padded arm before walking over to his workbench. Grabbing his VR visor, he settled into his chair just as Melissa emerged from her own workspace across the room. "So, did it work?" she asked, already knowing the answer from Tony's expression. "Nope, total failure," he shrugged. "Anyway, May's going to be here soon. Do me a favor and entertain her. Just make sure she doesn't wander into this part of the lab. The last thing I need is her seeing this mess." Melissa sighed, crossing her arms. "She's your intern. Why do I always have to babysit her?" Tony smirked as he positioned the visor over his eyes. "Because you're my secretary, so it's your job. Oh, and let her use the microbots. That should keep her entertained for a while," he teased, tapping a button on the side of the visor and disappearing into his VR workspace. Friday, Tony's voice echoed in the virtual environment. Bring up the DNA structure of the SYB01 and highlight the areas where you think the bonding process went wrong. Yes, boss. Pulling up the data now, Friday responded, her tone cool and efficient, as a holographic display of the symbiote's genetic makeup flickered into view, ready for analysis. A few hours later in VR time, after reviewing the data from the SYB01 bonding disaster, Tony was back in the lab, standing by the observation window. He had already requested the synthesis of SYB02, tweaking the formula to address the issues Friday had highlighted from the previous test. Friday, is SYB02 ready for testing? Tony asked, eyes narrowed at the sterile containment room. Synthesis of SYB02 is complete, boss. Baymax has already retrieved it and secured the next test subject. We're ready to proceed. Tony nodded, feeling a mix of determination and weariness. Let's hope this one doesn't end in an explosion. Begin the bonding process. Baymax, ever the diligent assistant, entered the room once again, carrying another metal and glass cylinder. This time, the goo inside was a darker shade of black, almost matte, and it appeared less erratic, moving with a slow, purposeful fluidity. It gave off a different vibe, more stable, more controlled. Baymax approached the cradle, repeating the same sequence, inserting the cylinder into the slot, securing it with a twist, and then carefully stepping back as the hatch opened, releasing SYB02 into the containment room. Inside the enclosure was another mouse, this one a bit larger and more robust than the previous test subject. It sniffed the air cautiously, oblivious to the danger about to descend upon it. SYB02 has been released, Friday reported, her voice maintaining its usual clinical precision. The symbiote appears to be more stable than its predecessor, showing fewer fluctuations in its structure. Tony watched as the black mass slithered across the floor, moving with eerie intent toward the mouse. Unlike SYB01, which had darted erratically toward its host, SYB02 approached the mouse slowly, almost deliberately, as if assessing it. The mouse tensed, its tiny eyes darting around the room, sensing the presence of the symbiote. It twitched and scurried in circles, but there was no escaping the inevitable. SYB02 has made contact, Friday announced. Initiating bonding process, the symbiote's tendrils began to snake out, wrapping themselves around the mouse's body. This time, there was no immediate screech of pain. The bonding appeared smoother, more controlled. The mouse stiffened, but it wasn't violently thrashing like the previous subject. Its eyes widened, and its limbs trembled slightly, but it seemed to be holding together. For a moment, Tony's heart lifted. Maybe this would work. Maybe SYB02 would finally stabilize, and they could move forward with real testing. But then Friday's voice cut through his thoughts. Warning, SYB02 is exhibiting abnormal energy fluctuations. Tony's eyes darted to the readings on the screen. The symbiote's internal energy levels were spiking rapidly, dangerously so. The black goo, which had been wrapping around the mouse in a smooth, controlled motion, began to pulse erratically. The mouse started to convulse, its small body jerking violently. Its eyes bulged, and foam bubbled from its mouth. This time, there was no explosion. Instead, the symbiote seemed to destabilize from the inside, its form collapsing in on itself. The mouse let out a weak, choked squeak before it slumped to the ground, twitching. SYB02 had withdrawn from the host, leaving the mouse alive but in a state of visible distress. The symbiote itself quivered and shrunk into a smaller, jittering mass, its once fluid movements now erratic and uncoordinated. Well, at least the mouse didn't explode this time, Tony muttered, trying to find some silver lining. Friday interrupted. The bonding process failed due to an energy feedback loop. SYB02 generated more internal energy than the host could process, causing the subject's nervous system to overload. The symbiote, unable to stabilize the energy, ultimately withdrew. Tony sighed, rubbing his temples. So, the host's biology wasn't equipped to handle the symbiote's energy production? Precisely, boss. While the symbiote's physical bonding was smoother, the excess energy created too much strain on the subject's neural pathways. Tony watched the twitching mouse, a pang of frustration settling in his chest. All right, burn it. Once again, flamethrowers descended from the ceiling, blasting the containment room with fire. The mouse and symbiote were engulfed in flames, the heat so intense that the entire scene blurred through the observation window. In seconds, both were reduced to ashes. Tony stepped back, staring at the smoldering remains through the glass. Okay, Friday back to square one. This time, we need to focus on energy regulation in the bonding process. Pull up all the relevant data on SYB02's energy output and start running simulations. Yes, boss. Beginning analysis now.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.